August 17, 1945. Willow Run, Michigan. The conv of olive-drab trucks rolled past an endless sea of steel and smoke. The sky above Detroit was gray, not from rain, but from production. Thick industrial haze drifted over the flat horizon, where smokestacks rose like forests of iron. Even at midday, the sun glowed faintly through the smog, diffused by the heat of a city that never truly slept. Inside one of the trucks, a group of 20 German engineers sat in silence. Their uniforms, now stripped of insignia, were clean but colorless, marked only by the small white patches of identification. Among them sat Dr. Otto Weiss ***, former chief designer at the Heinkel Aircraft Works, and Hans Grunwald ***, a propulsion engineer who had once helped develop the V-2 rocket's guidance systems. Their journey had begun in ruins, in the ashes of Peenemünde, Nordhausen, and Berlin. They had been captured by American intelligence officers during the final days of the Reich, given rations, clean clothing, and a promise. They would be taken to America not as prisoners, but as consultants. The men had expected humiliation, perhaps interrogation, but not this. The truck slowed as they passed a wide iron gate. Above it, in bold white letters, the sign read, Ford Motor Company, Willow Run Plant. Weiss leaned forward, squinting through the window. For a moment, he thought it must be a military base. There were guard towers, patrols, and fences stretching as far as the eye could see. But instead of tanks or barracks, there were hangars, massive hangars, each one large enough to swallow an airfield. The convoy came to a stop outside one of the main assembly buildings. The Americans dismounted first, their uniforms crisp, movements brisk but not hostile. "All right, gentlemen," said Captain Raymond Cooper ***, their escort. "This way, please. You're about to see what won the war." The Germans exchanged uncertain glances. The captain's tone wasn't mocking, it was almost proud, even reverent. Inside the hangar, the sound hit them first. A low, continuous thunder, the roar of hundreds of machines running in perfect rhythm. The smell of oil, rubber, and hot metal filled the air. Lines of workers, men and women both, moved like clockwork. Conveyor belts stretched hundreds of meters, carrying *** fuselage sections of B-24 Liberators ***, wings, engines, and crates of rivets. Grunwald's jaw clenched. His engineer's mind began calculating. 1, 2, 3 lines, he murmured, each with its own sub-assembly stations. Weiss whispered, "How many people are here?" Captain Cooper overheard. "At full capacity, 42,000, 3 shifts, 24 hours a day." The Germans stopped walking. The number didn't seem real. 42,000 workers in one factory, more than the entire population of some of their hometowns. At the far end of the hall, a finished bomber stood gleaming under floodlights. Mechanics were tightening bolts, polishing glass, loading instruments. A foreman shouted something above the noise, and within minutes the aircraft began to move, rolling toward the massive hangar doors that opened like a mouth to the open air. Weiss turned to Cooper. "How long from raw metal to flight?" 3.5 days, Cooper replied. "Used to be 60 before Ford retooled." The German engineers stood frozen, some scribbled notes, others simply stared. Grunwald's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. They followed the captain down another corridor, where a Jeep assembly line was running. Chassis frames moved steadily along rail systems, while workers installed engines, radios, and wheels in seamless order. No shouting, no panic, no shortage of parts. Everything was automated, smooth, precise. Cooper gestured toward a stack of crates near the wall. Each was stamped ***, spare RADIOS, 500 units. We ship these to Europe faster than they can jam 'em, he said with a grin. Weiss ran his fingers along one crate. The label alone looked like luxury. In Germany, a working tank radio had been worth its weight in gold. Here, they were shipping thousands across oceans as if they were candy. The group moved outside again, where a line of trucks waited. Beyond them, more factories stretched to the horizon: Packard, Chrysler, Dodge. Everywhere, the same smoke, the same movement, the same sense of infinite momentum. For the first time, one of the men began to cry. It was Kurt Baumer ***, a soft-spoken machinist from Bremen. He had built precision bearings for Messerschmitt engines, by hand, under bombing raids, using salvaged steel. Now he was staring at a warehouse that produced bearings by the million, each identical, each flawless. Weiss put a hand on his shoulder. "Kurt, it's only machines," he whispered. But Baumer shook his head. "No," he said quietly, voice trembling. "It's a civilization." They walked past a cafeteria where hundreds of American workers sat laughing over trays of food: meat, milk, cigarettes, even fruit. There was no fear, no scarcity, no ration cards. A radio played swing music in the corner. The war had ended, and yet the machines still ran, stronger than ever. Weiss felt something heavy sink in his stomach. Germany's factories had been masterpieces of precision, but fragile, brittle, centralized. One bomb could silence them. Here, every town seemed to have its own forge, its own heartbeat. By the time the convoy departed Willow Run that evening, none of the men spoke. Through the truck's small window, the setting sun glinted off smokestacks. Their light filtered through drifting clouds of industry. The horizon shimmered with motion: conveyors, trucks, cranes, all still working as darkness fell. Weiss leaned back against the cold metal wall, his eyes unfocused. "We thought we were the engineers of the future," he murmured, "but we were building in the past." Outside, Detroit kept roaring, and in that unending hum of engines, the captured men finally understood. They had been defeated not by bombs, but by abundance. The morning haze hung low over the skyline as the German engineers' convoy entered downtown Detroit. The sun reflected off thousands of glass windows and steel facades, a city that seemed made of industry itself. They passed rows of apartment blocks filled with workers, small diners serving breakfast, and billboards boasting wartime slogans: "Keep M rolling, Ford, Chrysler, Packard." Dr. Otto Weiss sat silently by the window of the truck, eyes tracing the endless flow of people and machines. Streetcars clanged down Jefferson Avenue, loaded with workers in overalls and women in patterned dresses. Trucks full of tank parts rumbled past in the opposite direction. The air smelled of oil and promise. Their escort, Captain Raymond Cooper, watched them curiously. "Not what you expected, huh?" he asked. Weiss shook his head slowly. "In Germany, we had engineers. Here, you have an army of them." The trucks halted before an immense building complex. The Packard Automotive Plant one of the largest in the world. Its brick and steel walls stretched for nearly a mile, windows streaked with soot and light. The Americans had converted it to produce aircraft engines, and now, even after victory, its machines kept running. Inside, the temperature rose with the heat of the machines. Conveyors clattered, pneumatic hammers thudded rhythmically, and the air shimmered from the motion of thousands of pistons and belts. Rows of Pratt and Whitney radial engines for bombers and transports gleamed under the work lamps, their metallic surfaces polished to mirror brightness. A foreman led them along a narrow catwalk above the floor. "Before the war," he shouted over the noise, "this plant built luxury cars. By 1944, we were rolling out over 50,000 aircraft engines a year." Hans Grunwald gripped the rail tightly. His eyes darted from engine to engine, counting, calculating. 50,000, he muttered in disbelief. "That's more engines than all of Germany built in 1944, civilian and military combined." Below them, American workers laughed as they worked. Young men whistling tunes, women tightening bolts with steady precision. There was no urgency, no fear of bombing raids, no panic. It was a rhythm of power, effortless and endless. One of the German men, Heinrich Müller*, couldn't help himself. "You work like this every day," he called down in halting English. A young woman looked up from her bench, smiled and shrugged. "Every day," she said. "War or peace doesn't matter. We just build." That sentence struck Weiss harder than any statistic. We just build. It was the difference between survival and supremacy. As they continued through the plant, Cooper gestured toward a line of engines being hoisted onto flat cars. "Those are headed to Buffalo for the C-47s. By the time they're installed, we'll already have replacements ready." Weiss exchanged glances with Grunwald. "How?" he asked quietly. "How can you build so much so quickly?" Cooper smiled. "Standardization. Everything fits everything. You don't rebuild from scratch, you just replace. Every nut, every bolt, every bearing, same size, same specs. It's like Lego for grown-ups." The Germans fell silent. In their own factories, every model demanded unique parts, custom-made components, and precise measurements. Their system valued craftsmanship. America valued asterisk replication. One broke under strain. The other multiplied. Later, the group was taken to a smaller but no less impressive facility. The Chrysler Arsenal tank plant in Warren. Even after the war, its massive production lines still operated to fulfill occupation contracts. As the engineers stepped inside, they froze. Before them, an assembly line of M4 Sherman tanks stretched nearly half a kilometer long. Bare hulls moved slowly along a track, each stopping at a station where teams fitted engines, transmissions, and turrets. Sparks flew as welders worked beneath hanging lamps. The air was thick with smoke, heat, and the smell of burning metal. An American supervisor noticed their awe and chuckled. "This line used to build 30 tanks a day," he said. "Now we're making peacetime tractors, but the process hasn't changed. Just the product." Grunwald's hand trembled slightly. 30 tanks a day. He tried to imagine it. In Germany, a single Panzer IV might take a week to complete, assembled under constant shortages, in bombed-out factories with flickering lights and air raid sirens. Here, a machine emerged every 40 minutes. Identical, reliable, replaceable. Near the exit, a young American mechanic was sitting on the turret of a freshly painted Sherman, tightening a bolt while listening to swing music on a portable radio. He noticed the visitors staring and grinned. "Good old Detroit steel," he said proudly, "built to last and built fast." Baumer, the machinist from Bremen, stopped walking. He looked up at the vast ceiling, at the cranes and pulleys and endless light. Tears welled in his eyes again, quietly, almost against his will. One of the guards stepped closer, uncertain. "You all right, pal?" Baumer nodded weakly. "Yes," he whispered. "I am only seeing the truth." Outside, the afternoon sun was blinding. Smoke drifted like ghosts over the city, glowing gold in the light. The convoy drove past a billboard that read, "Victory through production." None of the Germans spoke on the way back to their quarters. In the quiet hum of the truck's engine, Weiss finally said, almost to himself, "You Americans built war like others build peace." And in that sentence lay the deepest wound of all, because it was true. A low fog rolled over the Detroit River that morning, curling around the black skeletons of smokestacks and cranes. The Germans stood at the gates of what Captain Cooper called the beating heart of American production. From this one site, he explained, Ford could take in raw ore, coal, and rubber, and roll out finished tanks, trucks, and planes by the end of the week. Even before entering, the engineers could feel the vibration of the machinery through the ground. It was not the sharp clang of a small foundry. It was the deep, continuous rumble of a living organism. "Welcome to the Rouge," Cooper said, stepping aside to let them pass through the gates. 400 buildings, a mile and a half long, 100,000 workers. Weiss's throat went dry. 100,000. In Germany, that was the population of an industrial city. Here, it was one factory. The group followed a guide along a metal catwalk overlooking a steel mill in full operation. Molten iron poured from furnaces, cascading down chutes in blinding rivers of light. Sparks exploded as workers in heat-resistant suits guided the flow into molds. The glow lit up their faces like some infernal sun, the air trembling with heat. For a moment, no one spoke. Even men who had built rockets and jet engines were stunned into reverent silence. Baumer finally broke it with a whisper. "We fought an army of machines." The guide nodded without hearing him. "That's our open hearth line," he shouted over the roar. "It feeds our rolling mills right next door. By tomorrow morning, that iron becomes armor plate for trucks or ships." They moved on to the glass plant where conveyor belts carried glowing sheets of molten glass toward cooling lines. At the end, workers in clean overalls cut perfect rectangles with flawless precision, windows for tanks, bombers, and factories themselves. Mueller, the precision engineer, watched the process with fascination. "Each pane identical," he murmured. "Without measurement, without error." Captain Cooper glanced over. "Automated calibration," he explained proudly. "Henry Ford started it all, every machine calibrated to the next. No waste, no downtime." The Germans exchanged weary looks. In Germany, even in the height of the war, skilled men still made parts by hand, adjusting each machine, each mold. Precision had been an art. Here it was a system. As they crossed into the final assembly hall the full magnitude of the operation came into view. Aerial conveyors carried truck frames high above them. On the floor, hundreds of workers moved in rhythmic unison, each performing a small, practiced gesture, tightening a bolt, fitting a door, attaching a radio set. And always the same sound. The click-clack of pneumatic tools, the hum of conveyor belts, the low murmur of conversation and music. Every few minutes, a completed vehicle rolled forward, Ford-built troop truck olive green and flawless. A foreman in a crisp shirt checked the gauges, nodded, and waved it through. Another truck followed moments later. Then another. Weiss leaned against the railing, watching the unending procession. "It is not industry," he said quietly, almost to himself. "It is choreography." Grunwald nodded, his expression hollow. "In Germany, we built masterpieces. Here, they build legions." Captain Cooper overheard and smiled faintly. "That's the point, Doctor. We don't build one perfect machine. We build thousands of good ones. The war was never about who built the best. It was about who could build forever." The words settled over the men like dust. After lunch, they were escorted to the design offices overlooking the floor. American draftsmen, men barely in their 20s, sat at long tables sketching blueprints for next-generation transport vehicles. Each had a slide rule, a typewriter, and a small radio on the desk. The air was calm, disciplined, and focused. Weiss looked over one young man's shoulder and saw the label on the page: Post-War Logistics Vehicle Proposal. The war was barely over, yet these men were already designing for the next era. "They do not stop," Weiss said under his breath. "Even in victory, they plan for tomorrow." Outside the glass windows, smoke from the factory chimneys drifted toward the sky like gray banners of conquest. That evening, as the convoy returned to their quarters, the setting sun turned the Rouge River a molten orange. The silhouettes of cranes and factory stacks stretched long across the water, and for a fleeting moment, the city seemed to glow from within. Baumer sat quietly beside Weiss, hands clasped tightly together. "Do you think we could ever build like this?" he asked. Weiss exhaled slowly. "Not yet," he said, "because we built for glory. They build for function. Glory dies. Function endures." The truck drove on through the twilight, passing more factories, more rail lines, more bridges carrying freight toward the coasts. It felt endless, like a civilization built on motion itself. And as night fell over Detroit, the engineers finally understood what no speech, no surrender, and no defeat had ever truly taught them. Power was not just in weapons. Power was in production. The sky above Detroit was no longer gray, but glowing, lit by hundreds of furnaces, thousands of lamps, and the restless pulse of a city that refused to sleep. To the German engineers quartered in a converted administration building near the Rouge plant, the constant thrum of machinery had become a lullaby and a curse. It was the sound of defeat rendered mechanical, humming softly through every wall and window. Dr. Otto Weiss stood alone at the window of his room. Below, trucks rolled past in steady convoys toward the river docks. Barges waited with open hatches, steam rising from their decks, ready to swallow up another load of engines and armor plates bound for distant depots. The clock on the wall showed 11:30 p.m., but there was no sign of rest. Spotlights still cut through the smoke, and the foundries still roared. He turned as the door opened. Hans Grunwald stepped in, collar open, face pale. "They say we'll be sent west in a week," he said quietly. "Some to Dayton, some to Huntsville. They want us to teach what we know." Weiss nodded. "Teach them," he said softly. "It is they who should teach us." Grunwald sat down heavily on the edge of the cot. "Do you remember Nordhausen?" Weiss's eyes darkened. "Yes, the V2 tunnels, the dust, the noise, the hunger. We built rockets that could touch London, and yet we starved beside them." He gestured toward the glowing skyline. "Here, they feed their workers steak and milk while building fleets that fly across oceans. They made war into routine." Outside, a locomotive whistle echoed through the night. Weiss imagined the cargo, new jeeps, aircraft parts, radios, all stamped with dates newer than yesterday. The realization felt physical, like a weight pressing on his chest. The next morning, Captain Cooper gathered the group in a conference room lined with blueprint racks. On the wall hung a large map of the United States, dotted with pins marking shipyards, steel mills, and aircraft plants. "Gentlemen," he began, "you've seen Detroit. Multiply what you saw by every pin on this board. That's what you fought." No one interrupted. He pointed to the Great Lakes. "From here we can move iron from Minnesota to these mills in 2 days. From there to Pittsburgh for refining, and out to the Atlantic in 4. Everything connected, rail, river, road. No single factory wins wars. The network does." Weiss felt his mouth go dry. In Germany, rail lines had been shattered, fuel scarce, workers bombed into hiding. They had built miracles in chaos. The Americans built simplicity in abundance. Cooper lit a cigarette and exhaled a slow plume of smoke. "You men are brilliant, no doubt, but brilliance without scale is just art." He smiled faintly. "And art doesn't win wars." Grunwald's pen slipped from his hand. The sound was small but final, like the click of a closing latch. That afternoon, as they toured the Detroit Arsenal Proving Grounds the engineers watched American crews test tanks on muddy tracks. M4 Shermans and new M26 Pershings thundered past, their treads chewing up the earth. Mechanics in overalls lounged nearby, eating sandwiches, laughing over jokes. One man wiped grease from his hands and switched on a small radio balanced on the fender. The swing of Glenn Miller filled the air. Weiss's mind returned to Italy, to the front lines where his own panzers had fought without radios, their crews half deafened by shells, half blind without fuel. The contrast was unbearable. He removed his glasses and pressed the bridge of his nose, trying to block the memory. Kurt Baumer stood beside him, expression unreadable. "They enjoy their work," he said quietly. "Yes," Weiss replied, "because they are sure it will matter tomorrow." When the last tank completed its run, Captain Cooper turned to them. "You understand now, gentlemen," he said, not gloating, not cruel. "Your war was lost long before Normandy, maybe even before it began." No one answered. The wind carried the smell of oil and earth. Somewhere in the distance, a factory siren signaled the change of shift. That night, the group gathered in silence in their quarters. Someone had found a shortwave radio and tuned it to an American news station. The announcer's voice crackled through the static. Talk of post-war reconstruction, of new cars rolling off Detroit's lines, of the arsenal of democracy turning peacetime again. Baumer broke the silence. "They will never stop building, will they?" Weiss looked out the window one last time at the lights of the Rouge. "No," he said softly, "and that is why they never fear." He opened his notebook, creased, grease-stained, filled with sketches of conveyors and gear ratios, and wrote a final line beneath the others. "Victory belongs not to the genius of invention, but to the humility of repetition. We built marvels, they built momentum." He closed the notebook and set it beside his bed. Outside, the factories of Detroit kept working, glowing against the night like a second sunrise. The steady hum of industry rolled over the city, over the captured men, and out across the world that it had already remade. And somewhere in that ceaseless rhythm, they finally understood what true power sounded like.